you want. Therefore, we are saying it. So we are saying it can be available at that position number 2 of that hydroxyl group. You can put a phosphate group. So you can put a phosphate group at that position. So you move your hydrogen, then there's an oxygen P double bondo OH. So you put a phosphate group, but that drug is a prodrug because that hydroxyl group at that position must be free for that drug to have good activity. But once you put a phosphate group there, a phosphate group has very high water solubility, increases the water solubility. Remember when we were looking at septarorine, phosamil, I think. We have the septarorine, and you have the septarorine, which was the other one. The other one was septobip. The other one was septobipro. And the phosamil. I hope you can remember when we did mention that even with those cephalosporins, we changed the structure to give the drug higher water solubility, like for septarorine, phosamil, and phosamil is where also put a phosphate. So phosphate have got very high water solubility. When you add them, they have very groups, the high oxygen groups within the phosphate really drastically increase water solubility, and therefore you are able to give that drug as an injectable. And the same case applies. So it's not new. I'm only reminding you somewhere else you come across it. So this is not new, where you can put the phosphate, but the drug will be a prodrug, and it can be used for injection. It can be used as for injection. You can also, at that same position, you can also use palmitic acid. So you can also have, you can esterify it with palmitic acid. Just 1 minute. So you're also saying that hydroxyl group can be esterified with palmitic acid to give us clindamycin palmitate. But you can actually do it, you can do a derivatization at 2 points at that hydroxyl group at position number 2, and then also you add hydrochloric acid, and the hydrochloric acid is going to be around the nitrogen on the hydrochloric acid. So that the result is what we are calling clindamycin, or you get the clindamycin palmitate ester hydrochloride. So it is a palmitic ester, but it's also hydrochloric acid salt at the hydric acid. So at the hydric acid is palmitic, it is a hydrochloric acid salt. You've added hydrochloric acid at position number 2 prime, because you see we have to differentiate the ones, the groups within the hydric acid. We can call them 1, 2, 3, 4 up to number 5. The other ones in the sugar, we can call them 1 prime, 2 prime, 3 prime for purposes of differentiation, because these are different molecules, so we cannot continue the numbering. So the hydric acid, we call it 1, 2 up to 5, and the octoside sugar, we call it 1 prime, 2 prime, and so on. So this indeed, therefore, this hydroxyl group is at position 2 prime. So at position 2 prime, you derivatize with palmitic acid. At position 1 of the nitrogen, you add acid. So the resultant drug will be palmitate ester hydrochloride. I hope that is clear. And again, that is actually also used as a drug. The water insoluble palmitate, and of course, because of the palmitic acid, remember palmitic acid has quite a number of carbon atoms, making it water insoluble. It is also a prodrug. It's also a prodrug, and the advantage is when the drug is not soluble in the mouth, it's not soluble, then it has no taste. Most of these drugs, these antibiotics, which are very huge molecules, unfortunately, they are very bitter. Talked about, even when we were looking at antibiotics one, talked about the macrolides, they were bitter. We talked about the chloramphenicol, it was bitter. Actually, most of all those drugs are very bitter. So normally, again, you derivatize them into esters, because esters either have no taste or have a slightly bitter taste. So derivatization usually serves more than one purpose. That derivatization gives you a molecule that has much higher lipid solubility and therefore better penetration of the membranes, and hence better concentration. The derivatization also, more often than not, also gives you a molecule with much better taste, and therefore not bitter to the taste, for purposes of improving on the patient's compliance. Clindamycin has a clinical spectrum rather like the macrolide, although it distributes better into the bones. So again, so even its distribution, even its spectrum of action, because the spectrum of action, of course, is also dependent on the mode of action. Spectrum of action, of course, dependent on the mode of action, and also dependent on the physical chemical properties of that drug. So it looks like they have similarities in their physical chemical properties. They have similarities in their mode of action, and therefore we are saying the spectrum is very similar. But clindamycin has one advantage: distributes better in bones, and therefore sometimes when you find, like if you go to spinal injury, you would find a lot of use of clindamycin for patients where it does not have toxicity, because as we are going to see, it has one drawback of toxicity. So they have the lincosamides have high lipid solubility and wide distribution into the body and across cellular barriers. Once you have good lipid solubility, good they are bacteriostatic. They have a basic nature. Ion trapping occurs in milk and prostatic fluid when the transcellular pH is lower than the blood. We have talked about ion trapping. If the pH is lower than the blood, it means the pH is acidic. And once the pH is acidic, because of that, they are weakly basic. Then these drugs will be protonated at physiological pH. Once they are protonated at physiological pH within the cells, then they'll be trapped there. They can't leave. Just again, you have ion trapping with the PPI. So the ion trapping is coming in because these drugs are slightly basic, and the pH within the different areas, within the different cavities changes. The intracellular pH could be lower, more acidic, protonated, and therefore they will be trapped. Concentration of the CSF relatively low due to extensive plasma protein binding and relatively rapid elimination. We have mentioned they have got rapid elimination through oxidative end demethylation. Once you do oxidative end demethylation, of course, you reduce their lipid solubility, so they will start living, and then also they have very high plasma protein binding, so the depotization can also occur. Achieved in bone, also relatively low, and plus this is in comparison with the concentration within the plasma, but we are still saying they are drugs of choice when you have infections within the bones compared to the other drugs. But nevertheless, the concentration within the bones is within the bone is still lower than within the plasma, but they concentrate more in the bones compared. So that's a comparison compared to other antibacterial agents. They are well absorbed from the intestine. They are eliminated mainly by hepatic metabolism through oxidative end dealkylation, although about 20% is eliminated in active form. So the main method of metabolism, as we have said, is oxidative end dealkylation. Mode of action or resistance. The active ribosomal subunit, we have already mentioned that the binding sites are similar to those of erythromycin. The lincosamides prevent the transpeptidation during the formation of the starting on the NACET chain by inhibiting that enzyme. So all we are saying again, they are protein synthesis inhibitors, very, very similar to erythromycin. I'm trying to look at what I don't need in pharm chem. are saying acquired resistance to lincosamides may be due to modification of the bacterial target. So remember, we did mention, even when we were looking at the sulfonamides, even when we are looking at chlorphenical, when we were doing antibacterial agents, antibiotics one, we did say that sometimes the microorganism is able to acetylate. It is able to bring about acetylation. Remember, we did say acetylation of either position 1 hydroxyl group or position 3 hydroxyl group. Those hydroxyl groups are necessary for binding the receptor. So once you destroy either the drug or you destroy the site. You destroy the drug or you destroy the receptor where the drug binds, then the drug will not bind. So here this we are saying here it's a bacterial target, so it is the receptor. So there is structural modification of the structure, and you could have very slight structural modification. And we had mentioned somewhere when that slight structural modification occurs, there's a conformational change of the receptor. So there's a slight structural modification at the receptor, and of course the receptor, as we have already discussed here, is that the enzymes that are responsible for protein synthesis. Once there is a slight change in those receptors, there happens a conformational change occurs, and once a conformational change occurs within the receptor, the drugs will not be able to bind, but is coincidentally the amino acid the amino acid, the 3 amino acids that come in are able to bind the receptor, and therefore the protein synthesis still continues. They have an unusual antimicrobial spectrum. I think those ones you will do more of them in your pharmacology. That's why we do those pharmacologies and ceutics and so on. So let us look at the formulations, and we can note that lincosamides as the hydrochloride salt are bitter to the taste. Remember, the hydrochloride salts are just you adding hydrochloric acid, a bit of hydrochloric acid to the lincosamides, and then the position number 1 of the nitrogen at position number 1 is protonated. Those hydrochloride salts are usually bitter to the taste. So for oral formulations, they are given as the permitted esters or formulated in capsules. So when you see some of these drugs, even in capsules, there can be many reasons. There are some capsules which you will give so that the drug is not destroyed in the stomach. It passes the stomach, it gets into them where it can be released and bring about its own activity, what we call enteric coated. Sometimes you put them in capsule to avoid the bitterness. So you can give a drug in a capsule, the gelatin capsule. It is not, you don't taste it, and therefore the drug will have, it will not have any taste, but at least it will not have the bitter taste. And once you take it and it gets into the stomach, the gelatin capsule is dissolved, and of course the drug is released. Alternatively, you can do what esterification of the 2' hydroxyl group with palmitic acid to give you the palmitate ester hydrochloride. So you give it a palmitate ester hydrochloride. The hydrochloride is still necessary because of, especially when you do the palmitate ester, you're really going to reduce the water solubility. So the acid salt, very important for compensation of water solubility. It is given intravenously as clindamycin phosphate. Remember, I did mention again, structurally modified again at position 2' by adding a phosphate group there, and that can be used intravenously. In other words, remember, intravenously is just the way you are injecting it directly into the blood, and therefore the drug requires to maintain very high water solubility, otherwise it will crystallize out of the blood. So you're only giving it as the phosphate for purposes of it retaining very high solubility in the blood, and then when it gets to areas of low concentration, it diffuses, gets into the tissues, it gets into the bacteria, it undergoes hydrolysis, and the phosphate is released, or the palmitic acid is released, and you regenerate the hydroxyl group at position number 2'. Because when you derivatize at position number 2', just as we have talked of all these other drugs, chlorphenical, the macrolides, when you derivatize them into the ester, these are prodrugs, and they do not have any biological activity because they can't not interact with the receptor. So they must be hydrolyzed within the liver after having passed through, after having given you a flat taste, no bitter taste, having stability in the stomach, and then good lipid solubility, both within the GIT and even from the plasma into the tissues, into the bacteria, and therefore giving us very good biological activity. But before any action does happen, occur, they must be hydrolyzed to give you, the free drug, because it had disappeared a bit. Now, so that is the formulations, either this phosphate, either the hydrochloride, but if you do it as a hydrochloride, we have said you have also to put it in a capsule, or you give it as a tablet where you have the hydrochloride but palmitate. So you can formulate it in those three main ways, but the main one is, of course, the palmitate hydrochloride or the phosphate for injection, because the other one is quite bitter and you cannot give it as it is, unless we have said you give it in forms of a capsule. So we have said it is given intravenously as clindamycin phosphate, which is then converted into active clindamycin within the body. What does this? Am I touching? Okay. Sorry. Side effects, and as I had said earlier, especially clindamycin, it has a major side effect, and if the patient develops that side effect, then the drug must be withdrawn. That is what you call pseudomembranous colitis. It can cause pseudomembranous colitis, and the way it causes pseudomembranous colitis is like a super infection, whereby you do have the microorganism Clostridium difficile, and the Clostridium difficile can be a very difficult it can be a very difficult microbe, and therefore, if you give clindamycin and it kills all the other microorganisms, but you do have resistant Clostridium difficile, then you find that they will release, they usually release endotoxins, or they release toxins, and those toxins are responsible for what you call pseudomembranous colitis. So most severe of this is pseudomembranous colitis caused by release of two toxins, by Clostridium difficile and opportunistic anaerobe. We are calling it opportunistic because under normal circumstances it will be put in check. It will be there in the normal flora, as a normal flora within the GIT, because you know the GIT, it has a lot of microorganisms. But because all these microorganisms have to exist together, they compete for air. For some of them, the ones which require air, they compete for nutrients, because the nutrients, there is little of the nutrients and there are very many. So they compete for nutrients. For the ones that require air, they compete for air. So they keep each other in check. Now, if you do have the Clostridium difficile and it is resistant to clindamycin, so when you give your clindamycin, it will kill most of the other normal flora. So once it kills most of the other normal flora, this Clostridium difficile will thrive. And as it's thriving, as it is growing, it produces the toxins. It produces the two endotoxins. It produces the endotoxins, and once it produces those endotoxins, they are the ones that trigger, or that are responsible for pseudomembranous colitis. And the pseudomembranous colitis results in very severe diarrhea. And if that does happen, then you must withdraw your clindamycin and give another drug, perhaps like a macrolide, if the indication is the same. So it's overgrowth results. So we are just saying the overgrowth of this Clostridium difficile will result from suppression of the normal flora, the presence of which otherwise preserves a healthier ecological balance. It's because whenever you have these microorganisms, many of them, like even for some of the oral thrush, vaginal candidiasis that people get after taking antibiotics, it is because when you take some of those antibiotics, they stay in the stomach. They are not absorbed, so they will kill the normal flora within the stomach or within the other the genital. The genitalia or the genitourinary tract. So they will kill those microorganisms, the microorganisms that are susceptible. Once they kill those microorganisms, and these are antibiotics, Candida is not a bacteria. It is a fungus. But under normal circumstances, that fungus is kept in check because it has also to compete. It has to compete for food with all the normal flora. So the numbers will be very smooth, very low. But the minute you kill all the susceptible normal flora, the normal flora means they are not pathogenic, they're just there. They're normal flora, and some of them are very important because they also generate some of the that we require. So these normal flora help in maintaining these pathogenic, opportunistic microorganisms in check. So when you kill them, then the few microorganisms that are left will have a heyday. They will have a lot of food. They will have a lot of air and everything else, and therefore they thrive. And that is also how you get candidiasis, both oral thrush, all the other thrush. You get it because you have killed normal flora that helps to keep the pathogenic microorganisms under check and in very low numbers, and hence no infection. So that is one of the areas, or one of the problems of mainly clindamycin, is the fact that you do have Clostridium difficile, I think, which is a gram-positive microorganism. If it is not sensitive, it is not killed, it will thrive, and therefore, and in thriving, it will produce those endotoxins, and they are the ones that are responsible for the pseudomembranous colitis. In case it happens, then you withdraw the clindamycin, and you must look for another drug, either through culture and sensitivity test, or you look at the spectrum. You look at the spectrum profiles of the different drugs, you see whether they are similar, and therefore you can be able to exchange one drug for another. And I think with that, again, as I said, I promised, finished. That is the end. As I told you, I normally make sure I have done the bulkier work at the beginning, because once you do the bulkier work at the beginning, you also have by the time you're finishing, you have also had a lot of the terminologies, and you've gotten familiar with the terminologies. They're not very new. But again, we started with the bulky groups. We started bulky groups, and once we finished with the bulky groups, then these other small ones are fall into place very easily. So I think that is supposed to be the last topic in the antibacterial unit. Let's see if there is a question. And I'm really thankful to God. I was really worried because, as I have said, this year, this closing of this year, not the best for me and my family. We got a bit, but God is faithful. We are there. We are okay. So, do we have any questions? I'll tell you, I'm very excited to have finished. Any questions, students? Any questions? Now you're actually ready for the exam, so you can read. Tell me when we can do our cut. Starting on 17th, and I'm very happy that we have finished. Do you have any assignment you have not handed in? Do you have any assignment that you have not handed in, Jacinta? Jacinta, I don't know. I seem like you're offline. Jacinta, you're offline. Jacinta, my goodness. Jacinta, you're offline, eh? From 10:27. You just logged in and went offline. All. Jacinta. Jacinta. Wow. Like she's offline. Do you have anybody else, the deputy? Do you have any assignment you have not added in? Any? You have added in all your assignments. Yes, Shalom. There's one pending. So when can I have it? I need now to wrap up and mark, and so now we are done. So I think with your class, we have finished antibacterial agents too, and we had finished the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So I think we are done. Wow, by next week when? Or early next week? Shalom. Early next week, because I need to mark. So with your class now, we are done. So once I was told we are opening tomorrow. So kindly, when we are back, we can have the cut as early, anytime next week, as early as possible next week, so that you can prepare for your exams. So you have time now to read. Any questions? Do we have any questions? Wow, thank you, God. That was easy. That is great. That's God's doing. That's God's doing. Finishing. Sounds very good. So please sign in if you don't have any questions. If you have any questions, please raise them. Thank you so much for even availing yourself today. We at least had about 33, 34, but actually there's a time you are 35, because we are done. And now you have all the time to read. It was an uphill task, but God is faithful. God is faithful in all situations. I did not see like we'd ever finish. Thank you, my students. Thank you. Make sure you do your write-ups, hand them in on time to, I believe it's Tom who marks for you, who checks them. So hand them in early. Those reports are very, very essential for you. Very, very important. Good marks. Free marks. Those are actually free marks. They give you free marks. So make sure you do them well. Hand them on time. Make sure you do not fail to hand in. Not fail to hand in. Even if it's 2 or 3 practicals, as advised by Tom, so that you can get your full marks. And with that, I think mine is to wish you a happy new year full of God's abundance and blessings. At least we are just getting there now, almost there to 5th year. And we all pray together, united together. We pray that the Lord will hold our hand, the Lord will protect us, especially during this pandemic, this COVID. It's a terrible disease. It comes on and off, on and off. And also it's coming with so many other funny diseases that are very difficult to understand. And therefore, it is really messing on the finances of family, and putting a lot of financial constraints, because also so many family members lost jobs, businesses are not working. Then there's also a total mess, especially on the schedule of the high school and primary. Like my grandson was telling me that this year they're having 4 terms or something like that they will be grade 2 and grade 3 at the same time. So, and when you talk about having 4 terms in 1 year, you can imagine what that means in terms of the financial demand on the parent. So not only has it robbed us of many of our friends, cause also messed many of our people financially. It's a terrifying disease, I must admit. It's a very terrifying disease. But we are happy that the virility is actually going down, because when you compare the first COVID, the second one, the Delta, and now the Omicron, you find that the Omicron is a little bit milder, it's a little bit safer. You cannot compare with the first and second one. And therefore, even if there is more mutations, as we are saying, you'd expect that the mutant, even the mutant of this, if it's going to happen, you'd expect that the virality will continue going down up to the point where it will now cease to be a pandemic. And that is our prayer. But we're also advising that if you haven't been injected, please be injected. The severity of the disease for those injected is a little bit lower than for those not injected. So even at home, advise, tell people to get injected, because if you get the disease and you have been injected, the symptoms, the signs and symptoms, the severity of the disease is much bearable. If you get the disease when you're not injected, and of course, especially with advanced age, the dangers are very, very high. So you are the ones in medical field, you know about these things. So those who either whether through because of religious connections and so on, do not want to be injected. Sometimes it's good to talk to them and to persuade them and to make them understand that indeed it is not in vain. When some people say that you should not be injected, even when you get injected, you get sick. But I can assure you the difference is when you have the injection, the severity of the disease is much lower than when you do not have the injection. And of course, the more severe the disease is, of course, sometimes the more, especially for the old age, the more expensive it is to manage it, because you might end up in hospital on oxygen. But more often than not, for those who have been vaccinated, not injected, rather vaccinated, for those who have been vaccinated, find that they are not ending up in hospital. They are doing home-based treatment or management, and without a lot of extreme pressure on the lungs. That would be what I would request of you. But still keep safe. Wear your mask. Keep your distance. Please also sanitize. COVID is actually real. And with those few remarks, I wish you all the best. Read well, prepare well, and then last Jacinta, so that I know the day you will be doing the cut next week. Thank you.